Palestinian officials have condemned a U.S. decision to withdraw all funding from the United Nations agency that supports Palestinian refugees. The United States was, until last year, the biggest contributor to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which helps 5 million people across the Middle East. Yolande Nell reports from Jerusalem.
Pupils starting a new term at UN-run schools this week. But it's not clear if these will still be open by the end of the month. Already, UNRWA was facing a financial crisis after the US froze $300 million in funds it planned to give this year. Now it's cutting off all support. Washington calls the agency irredeemably flawed, expressing concern about the impact on innocent Palestinians, but saying that UNRWA has failed to reform and reset how it works. Back in 1948, some 700,000 Palestinians were displaced in the war that led to the creation of the State of Israel. The UN Relief and Works Agency was set up to take care of them, and over time, their descendants. There are now over 5 million registered refugees in the Palestinian territories, but also in Jordan, Lebanon and Syria. Many still live in refugee camps, these overcrowded neighborhoods, and rely on UNRWA services. Most Palestinians here want the right to return to their ancestral land that now lies within Israel. That's what the big key symbolises. Israel, of course, rejects that claim. And along with the United States, it accuses UNRWA of perpetuating false hopes and the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Earlier this year, I asked the Israeli Prime Minister about the agency.
The perpetuation of the dream of bringing the descendants of refugees back to Jaffa is what sustains this conflict. UNRWA is part of the problem, not part of the solution.
Israel backs the new US move, but Palestinians say Washington is trying to decide the fate of refugees without peace talks.
What is the American administration doing? They are undermining the moderate forces in Palestine and Israel. Those elements who want to achieve peace peacefully based on a two-state solution are being destroyed.
In Gaza, the recent deadly protests on the border with Israel began because of the refugee issue. Now there are fears of further violence and warnings of dangerous consequences for the region if new funds for UNRWA can't be found. Yolande Nell, BBC News.
Well, a senior member of the Palestinian Liberation Organization described the US move as a cruel way of punishing the people.
Are institutions that have been providing services, including health and educational and so on, social welfare services. You cannot suddenly turn off the tap and then decide that you can find alternatives. You cannot. They've been trying desperately. The Palestinian leadership has been trying desperately to find alternative funding. This is a punitive measure. It's a cruel, calculated way of punishing the Palestinians because we did not surrender to Israel and we did not accept American dictates. This is a way of telling the world, if you do not do what we tell you, if you do not accept the victimization of the Palestinians, then we will punish the Palestinians even further. They are trying to increase the $38 billion they are giving Israel, while they are removing $200 million that they are giving to the victims.
All right, the Palestinian Authority lashing out at President Trump after the State Department announced a $200 million cut in annual aid to the Palestinians. The U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, saying Mideast nations are not stepping up to fill the void. Reaction now from the Palestinian leadership.
Well, very clearly, the U.S. cutting of aid to Palestine is a form of cheap blackmail. And it shows a certain degree of moral and political bankruptcy. We are not willing to pay a price for our rights, and we are not selling our rights for a fistful of dollars.
Joining us now live, Waleed Faris. He's the, of course, Fox News national security and foreign policy analyst. Good to have you as always, sir.
Thank you, Ed.
So you get the sense from the Trump administration that the president wants to unveil a Mideast peace plan. There's been a lot of anticipation about that, and that he's frankly frustrated about providing carrots to the Palestinians that he doesn't think really provides anything by way of actual substantive gains. And so maybe he's trying the stick approach. Do you think it's smart or not?
Look, the Trump administration has been trying to evaluate this aid that has been for many, many years, actually, to the Palestinian Authority. He needs Abu Abbas or Mahmoud Abbas, to help him in engaging with the Israelis and the Egyptians and the Saudis. He's not getting that support. So maybe that move to cut off the aid for now is to encourage Mahmoud Abbas. On the other hand, I would strongly recommend that there should be an aid anyway, but it could be dispensed by the United States directly to NGOs and other elements. We need to be engaged with the Palestinian community. We can, if we want, and that's what the administration did, stop that aid to the government there because the government is not helping, and direct it in other directions.
Well, clearly the president is trying to keep a close eye on the hard-earned tax dollars that are sent by our viewers to the American government. They want to make sure it's being spent wisely. What is your response? What might be a smarter way to do this moving forward?
I think we have to look at Gaza. The obstruction is coming from Gaza. I think the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, nothing has been happening because they are obstructed by Hamas in Gaza. And Hamas is controlled by whom at the end of the day? By Iran. So it's Hezbollah. I think that this whole vicious circle of Hamas, Palestinian Authority, the struggle with Israel is all controlled from Tehran. So the focus should be on a change in Iran will get you a change in Gaza, in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon. A lot of bonuses.
And yet, as you look around the Middle East, and nobody does it better than you, Iran has a lot of spots where they're winning right now.
They have been winning actually since 2011, since we withdrew from Iraq. They almost seized Iraq. They have connected with the Assad regime, as you know. They have Hezbollah in Lebanon. They went all the way to Yemen. But they are pounding the Saudis, the UAE, the Kuwaitis, and many other countries with the influence they have. They are omnipresent even in Africa and Latin America. So the maximum expansion of Iraq has been reached. What is happening right now is that under this administration, and I think this Congress as well, though divided on many other issues, is with the administration and pushing back against the Iranians to withdraw from the region.
Well, interesting. I spoke, Waleed, this weekend to a very senior Israeli official who told me they are still quite happy that the president brushed Iran back by pulling out of the nuclear deal negotiated by President Obama. They think this President Trump, is taking a tougher stance, but they also know that after the midterm elections here in the U.S., the Israelis are expecting the president to release that Mideast peace plan that I mentioned, and they know that the Israelis are going to have to make some concessions as well.
The Israelis are concerned of any concessions in the present context. They are concerned that if they do concessions, then Hamas will fill the void, not the Palestinian Authority. We've seen it in, a decade and a half. What probably would be a different approach would be to shrink the Iranian influence that would build up the moderate Arabs, the Arab coalition with whom we have great relations, and therefore allow the presence of moderate Palestinians who can push back against Hamas. The equation goes always back to Iran.
Complicated issue, but how do you shrink Iran's power right now? What would you suggest to this president?
Withdrawing from the Iran deal was huge. The effects of that withdrawal economically with the sanctions is going to be a plus. I mean, the next few months, and we're going to have the final stage of putting the best sanctions on Iran. But that is not enough. What we need to do is to engage with the Iranian opposition, is to engage with Iranian civil society. We don't need to be inside Iran. Half of Iran is against the regime. So that's the path for us to follow, in my view, if I can advise.
Yeah, and the president has suggested in some public remarks that he believes Iran and its leadership is in a precarious place right now because of the nuclear deal you mentioned, the U.S. pulling out. Their economy has already been in pretty desperate straits. The U.S. And world sanctions coming back, snapping back, if you will. How precarious of a position is the Iranian leadership in now?
It's at the same time strong because we haven't stopped them really in Syria and in Iraq. The Arab coalition has done a certain job in Yemen. Hezbollah still controls Lebanon. What we need to add to our strategy, in addition to Iran's civil society, is to engage with our allies within those three countries. We have many allies in Iraq. We have kind of abandoned them. We need to go back and work with them. Kurds, moderate Shia, moderate Sunni. In Syria as well, there are a few moves we could do in eastern Syria that could block Iran from bringing more weapons to Syria. And in Lebanon, we have completely abandoned civil society against Hezbollah. We need to change that course. I think the president and the administration wants to do that, but what we have had here in Washington over the past year did not help.
Waleed, I've got 30 seconds, and I know it's a tight window to try to answer this question, but what are the prospects of the president's peace plan when it comes together? Again, I'm hearing after the midterm, sometime late this year, early next year. What are the prospects for peace in the new year?
Look, if the president and his administration are backed by the next majority in Congress, that's very important because we need all the support of all the quarters in Washington, then by 2019, we will be able, along with the Arab coalition, our allies, to make sure that we have an alternative to the radicals in the Palestinian Gaza Strip, and that would be the beginning of a long journey leading to a breakthrough in the Israeli-Palestinian problem.
All right, Waleed Faris, very important issue to discuss today. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you so much.
All right, Arthel.
The United States is officially cutting hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to the UN agency in charge of helping Palestinian refugees. It's the latest move creating tension between Palestinians and the Trump administration. Earlier this year, the U.S. government recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Dominic Velitis has more from London.
Well, this will undoubtedly hurt the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA for short. For decades, the US has been the organization's largest single donor. Now, back in January, Washington announced it would be withholding a large chunk of its funding while declaring it was no longer willing to shoulder the burden of the organization's running costs. And then, following a review, the US described the organization as irredeemably flawed before announcing that it would in fact be pulling all funding to UNRWA. A key issue for the US, and indeed for Israel, it seems, is the way UNRWA counts the number of Palestinian refugees, specifically how it includes the descendants of Palestinians originally displaced by the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. And that has implications for lots of Palestinians who believe they have a right to return to their ancestral homes. Now, in a statement, UNRWA, which provides for more than 5 million people in the Middle East, expressed deep regret and disappointment at the US decision to cut funding. Here's a little more, though, from UNRWA's chief spokesperson, Chris Gunnis.
International law must be respected, UN resolutions must be respected, and of course, if there is to be a resolution of the refugee crisis, then the refugees themselves must be consulted, and they have rights. You cannot simply airbrush out of history and out of the equation 5.4 million people.
Now, we've also heard from the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas. He described the US's decision to cut funding to UNRWA as an assault against his people, adding the move was in defiance of UN resolutions, a similar line to the one you just heard from Chris Gunnis there. And while supporters of America's decision to cut UNRWA's funding have described it as a win for US taxpayers and peace, others are warning the move could create more extremism and instability in the Middle East. Dominic Velitis, CBC News, London.